Hi, and welcome to A New Year and a New Hope. It's the fourth episode in our limited series podcast, Our WWII Dad. I'm Chris Cangilla, and joined, of course, as always, by my brother Ken Cangilla. And we created this limited series pod to share the stories of our father, Army Private First Class Louis T. Cangilla, a soldier with the 99th Infantry Battalion Separate, fighting in Europe during World War II. In our last episode, we kind of centered in on Dad's involvement in the Battle of the Bulge, right, Ken?
That's right, Chris. It was probably one of the tougher things he had to go through. Certainly, the weather conditions made it that much worse with the amount of cold and snow, and really the surprise attack that they came under during the Battle of the Bulge. No one really had expected it. So they had been on the lines for quite some time in the Malmedy area, and they were in need of some rest and some refitting. And so they were finally able to exit that area around late January of 1945 in the new year.
So what happened to the 99th and Dad? Where'd they go next?
Well, as I was thinking about them exiting Malmedy, it occurred to me when I exited that area, as I drove out of town, I passed not the cathedral, but a smaller church steeple. And I remembered that church steeple. I had seen it somewhere else before. So I dug back through the old photos. And sure enough, you can see the new church, the current church steeple, and then compare it to the old church steeple. And what it captures in the old photo is the depth of the snow. And of course, there's a Jeep in it. There's Jeeps everywhere I seem to go in this story. There's a Jeep in it pulling a trailer, and it's probably from Dad's company, or at least from his battalion. So that was kind of interesting to see that as I was pulling out of Malmedy myself.
Yeah, we kind of know it snowed, but to see that amount of snow, when you saw the pictures of the town square earlier, maybe a week or so before that, it was dry. So what an incredible photo that is.
Right.
Now, you told me that there were 1 million soldiers, or troops, I should say, on both sides of this war during the Battle of the Bulge. So that area must have been just overrun with a ton of soldiers from all different branches, right?
Yeah, they were called in from every parts of Europe to reinforce at the Bulge. So they came from everywhere and were spread out all along that area, from really Malmedy kind of at the top all the way down below Bastogne at the bottom. Yeah, so there's soldiers everywhere. But lo and behold, something really interesting happens. Dad's in Belgium, and his brother James, who's I think 5 years older than he is, he's with the 28th Signal Corps, and I believe they were fighting just a little bit south of Dad's positions. And somewhere in Belgium, he runs into his brother, and they have an opportunity to take some pictures together. And what a homecoming that must have felt like, to have been gone, since 1943. You're this young man. You've run into your older brother, which has got to feel good, right? You like older brothers, right, Chris?
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say. I
Yeah.
don't get to run into you other than every week on this podcast, but I'd like to see you in person.
Right. Yeah. So he runs into his older brother out in this field somewhere in Belgium. I don't know how it happened, if they got wind that each other's companies were there. And so they get a chance to reunite. And it's one of my favorite photos that I found going through his things, because Dad's standing there next to his taller brother, and Dad's flicking him on the helmet, just jacking around instead of like taking the tough guy pose, And it just really, to me, captured the joy in that reunion.
Yeah, I saw that photo, and I thought that Dad was trying to measure that he was, maybe growing a little bit on his older brother, but now he was flicking his helmet. Why not, right?
Right. I mean, it's just perfectly, what you would expect from brothers. And so what a reunion that must have been.
It's so cool. We discussed in an early episode of this series that Dad had his dad and his 4 brothers, I should say, all served in World War II. And in fact, they made the newspaper in their hometown of East Liberty, Pennsylvania. What an incredible time that was.
Yeah, that article in the East Liberty paper was June 16th, 1944, which was 10 days after D-Day happened. So it's an article showing these 5 brothers all over the world fighting in different theaters. And of course, Dad runs into Jamie. But there's another story and another short newspaper article that came out in the Pittsburgh area Jamie runs into John in France, and I don't know exactly when it happens, but it's probably shortly after running into Dad. So there's another reunion, and I have the old article. I found it when I went through Dad's things. I'm just gonna. It's really short, but I'll just read a couple
Please.
things. Yeah. So it says, two of the local boys are in the European theater. They were united at the front somewhere in France, according to a letter received by their father. Corporal John F. Cangilla wrote his father that last month, while he was resting in a bunk at his camp, he saw when he looked up, he saw his brother, Corporal James Cangilla, who was serving in the same division but with a different unit several miles away. Each knew the other was in the same area, but they never had run into each other before, and it was their first meeting in nearly 3 years.
That's just remarkable. But there's more of these chance meetings, isn't there?
Yes, it goes one step further even. So the South Pacific holds Dad's brother. We called him Uncle Marcy, Maurice. He's an ordnance man, so he loads bombs. Okay. And his brother Dad's brother Steve is in the Navy in the South Pacific. And Uncle Marcy's on Tinian Island. And Uncle Steve's ship pulls into Saipan. And so somehow Steve gets word that Marcy's just an island away, and Steve's ship was in for repairs. So I don't know how he island hopped, but he got there. So he gets over to Marcy's side and pops in to see him. And there's an interesting article about Marcy that came out 20 years later. And in that article, Marcy says there were two things that really meant a lot to him when he was overseas. He says one was, I was one of the guys that loaded one of the atom bombs. So from a historical standpoint, that was very significant. He goes, the other thing that was special to me is my brother Steve walks in and says, "Hiya, bud. How you doing?" And he goes, I knew his ship was over in Saipan, but he goes, had no idea I'd run into him. And so he ranked that right up there with a historical event, running into his brother. So these brothers had to be pretty close.
Absolutely. And it's so cool in thinking about the strides that they went to, because, if Marcy was truly working on the A-bomb, right, and loading that's got to be really secretive and really protective.
Right.
And yet Steve worked really hard to get to see his brother. So, yeah, they were definitely close, right?
Yeah, and the way you say that is a good point. A lot of those guys were in lockdown when that was happening. So I have a feeling that Steve probably was able to see Marcy well before the loading of the atom bomb. But that I had heard that atom bomb story from the relatives, years ago, and you kind of think, well, maybe he was close. Maybe he saw it go by or something. You think these stories are blown up, right?
Right. It's like, people say they're reincarnated. They're never reincarnated to like a toilet brush. They're always somebody famous, like a prince or something, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So I loaded the atom bomb, but this could be true, right?
Well, it's, I believe it's true because I found a newspaper article, and I think it's from the Pittsburgh Gazette, but I'm not sure because the byline's not on there. But it's an article that says 20 years later, A-bomb horror lingers, and they interview Uncle Marcy. Now he's a 49-year-old man, and so they interview him about loading the bomb. And I even found a letter in Dad's things. There was a letter that was issued, I think, by Bill Clinton, even years later, thanking Uncle Marcy for his contribution to ending the war in the South Pacific. So that really got me curious. I go down one rabbit hole for Dad. Now I'm looking at the other brothers, trying to dig up some more information. And so I got to thinking, okay, this is a historical event, right? This is a big, big deal. So I get on YouTube and I just start looking for footage. I'm like, they have to film this. And sure enough, I find some footage, and there's like a 3-part series about it. And each one, there's no sound. Each one's about, I don't know, 10 minutes long. So I go through the first one, I don't see him. Go through the second one, I don't see him. Go through the third one, and they're loading. I can see that it's the shape of the bomb's different. Okay, so this is Fat Man.
Right.
A little boy was the first one. Fat Man's the second bomb, and it's a lot rounder for some reason. So I'm like, this is the right bomb. So it shows these guys loading it. And Uncle Marcy was a heavier man. He had a very round face, and he carried a little bit extra weight. And it's probably why he was on the ordnance crew, because he's probably a big, strong guy. but he wasn't really the fittest guy to be running up and down hills.
Sure.
So I'm looking for a guy that's a little heavier, right? So I watch these guys. They load the bomb, and it was very technical how they had to do it, and they have to get it on a truck, and they have to truck it out to the airfield. And driving it out to the airfield is this tractor trailer, and the front passenger side door is open, and this is from a long ways away, and then it gets a little bit closer. Front passenger side doors open, and there's a man standing up and looking above the door, and he's got this round face. And Chris, I look at the photo in the newspaper, and I look at the video on YouTube, and it's got to be Uncle Marcy. So the stories were true. He loaded the atom bomb, and it eventually got loaded on a airplane called Boxcar, Bock', which is a play on word for like a railroad boxcar,
Yeah, sure.
which I thought was cute. So he gets it loaded on there, and they send it to Nagasaki, and it's the second bomb that falls, and I believe it was August 8th of 1945, and after the second bomb fell, the Japanese surrendered, and it ended the war. Now the Japanese didn't know we were out of bombs at that point,
Yeah.
but they thought, okay, yeah, this is just they're going to keep coming.
Yep.
So effectively, Uncle Marcy was able to help end the war in the Pacific by loading that ordnance, and he found his place
Along
in history.
with his four brothers and their jobs and all the other brothers out there in the service, because they all work together for sure. It's remarkable that we're talking about the atom bomb this particular weekend, and that we're releasing this podcast on this weekend because the film Oppenheimer was released this weekend. And of course, that's about J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was the director of the Los Alamos lab. And he was responsible for the research and the design of all these A-bombs. So it's a crazy kind of full circle thing again. So let's get back to Dad's story. Okay. So running into your brothers halfway around the world, in the war is quite remarkable. Let's get back to his journey. What are the chances, that he would see Uncle Jamie, and then what happened next?
Well, I think it just blows my mind that they had so many reunions, and I just wonder if there's other stories out there like that. I would love to hear from people that brothers or uncles or cousins ran into each other. Would be really neat. So it's a fascinating story, but I have to go back to what kind of got me on this journey years ago. This is probably 10 years ago. So, Dad had this old credenza, and he had all this stuff kind of crammed in there. And so I was over visiting Mom once, and I, started talking to her about the war and stuff. She goes, well, look through this stuff. So I'm starting to look through it, and I come across an old cigar box. You can tell it's old because I think the price of the cigars in it were 15 cents a piece. My son Wes would love that because he likes cigars.
There you go.
So I'm digging through it, and I find this prayer card, and it's a 1945 calendar on the back of this prayer card, and on the front I think is the Lord's Prayer. So I flip it over, and I'm looking at the back of it, and it shows the months and all the dates, so you know what day it is. And first thing I noticed is October 28th is circled. Well, what's October 28th?
Yeah, it's birthday.
Right. So he circles his birthday. I'm like, okay, I get that. But then I see all these little hash marks by just about 11 dates on the card. And I get to looking at them like, why did Dad mark those dates on the card? That was really interesting to me. And I got to thinking, soldiers, when they wrote home, they weren't supposed to say where they were, and they would edit stuff out. So I'm thinking, knowing Dad, he wanted to remember certain occurrences. So I looked at the tick marks, and then I started digging through the Howard Bergen's book and things like that. And sure enough, Chris, lo and behold, the card is my Rosetta Stone, and it opens up all of Dad's travels in 1945.
It's your principal piece of this whole adventure, right? I mean, because you wouldn't have known to go to these places. Sure, the 99th were certain places, but with these tick marks on this, prayer card, that your father was most likely in the same places where these battles took place. Yeah.
It was really neat that he kept it. And so, I looked at the tick marks, and I'm like, okay, he marked January 18th. Okay, that's when they left Malmedy and went back to Tilf to get ready, for the next phase. Then another important date comes up, April 2nd. they have to go back to Aachen from where they went after Tilf. So they go from Tilf to Barneville, which is clear across, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Then back to Aachen, and then he has other significant dates, including April 11th when they first crossed the Rhine into Germany. May 13th, he's in Regensburg. May 29th, they sail to Norway, and then June 4th, they arrive in Oslo, Norway. So these were significant dates, and since it's a new year, 1945, I want to take you through what was going on in those places he went to during those dates.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like you broke a code, you're a code breaker, not like some of the Native Americans that broke the codes for the guys in World War II, but you did your own work and you figured out where our dad was. So which is incredible detective work there, brother. So
thank you.
Let's go with what was next. Was it Barnesville that he went next?
Yeah. So they load up in trucks from Tilf, and it's late January, and they're trucked all the way to Barneville, France, which is clear over on the coast of the Atlantic. So it's I think it's, I forgot to look up the miles, but I think it's, many, many miles, 600 miles or something like that. And I don't know if Dad was driving the Jeep then or not, whether he was, and he would have loved to probably have had the Jeep versus riding in the back of those, those trucks with 6 wheels on them, that had to be cold and miserable. So they truck about halfway across, maybe 2/3 of the way across. They get some sleep for the night, and then they finish the journey into Barneville. And so they pack into Barneville, and the Army, in its infinite wisdom, decides the 99th Infantry Battalion separate is no longer going to be separate. So they create the 474th Infantry Regiment, which is a lot bigger size than a battalion. And so they not only fold in the 99th, they fold them in with the Rangers of the 1st Special Service Force.
Wow.
And these guys were kind of famous from what they had done in Anzio in Italy. And then they also fold them in with another group, and they add more tanks and things like that to them. So now they become the 474th Infantry Regiment.
Wow.
And so now they're a bigger group. There's guys everywhere, so they're packed in there. And I guess it was pretty miserable. The weather was still crummy. You're on the coast of France. When I was there, we were pretty close to the coast of France, and it was rainy. And
you were there in June, right? Or
I was in May. Yeah. Actually, it was going late May. And so they're there in January, February, March. It had to be miserable, and I think they were staying in tents. So, hopefully they were able to get some potbelly stoves set up and things like that. But so they're there, and they're practicing. Well, the reason I think they're there is just off the coast. There's 2 islands. There's Guernsey, and I'm going to draw a blank on the second. Guernsey and Jersey.
Okay.
These islands just off the coast of France. Well, the Germans are occupying those islands still.
Holy smokes.
Yeah. So I think this force was created. I think they were going to have to do a miniature D-Day and invade these islands. So they were practicing for that and getting ready to do those kind of things. And the only action they ended up seeing there was in late March 9th. The Germans, some of them left the island and did a commando raid into the mainland of France. So at 2:00 in the morning, these guys are yelled at, get out of your tents, grab your gear. We got to get to this immediately. They think it's a full scale attack. Well, it was just a commando raid, and all the Germans got was a boat full of coal to take back to keep their ovens going. So they ended up deciding just to leave the Germans alone out there because they weren't attacking us anymore. So they kept enough troops there. But the 474th is now on the move again, and they're moving them back to Aachen.
So do we have any pictures of Dad from this time? We haven't had many since earlier.
Yeah. So what's interesting about this time is you can tell they had more downtime. In fact, some of the things I've read, they get more passes to go to Cherbourg and stuff like that.
Okay.
So somebody must have got a camera along the way, because I find a lot of photos from kind of this time through the end of the war that Dad was able to get snapshots on, and they're in his belongings. So I come across this one photo, and it just really struck me. It's him leaning up against what I think is a tank destroyer. I'm not an expert on these vehicles, but it looks like a tank destroyer. He's leaning up against a tank destroyer with who I believe is Captain Tom Scadam, who was his commander for C Company. And it's just a great picture. Dad's got a cigar. He's got his head cocked, and he just looks, Chris, like like a different man. You can
Yeah.
tell he's grown up, he's experienced the war. He's experienced a lot of things that as that 18-year-old wide-eyed kid from Pittsburgh had no idea he was going to walk into. And so I went back and I compared it to a picture I have from a newspaper that was taken of him in a stag line, which is to dance with the local
Yeah.
gals, and it's taken in Camp Croft. So he's just
A kid
in the
and
service.
yeah.
You look at the comparison of the pictures, Chris, and it's not a great picture, Dad, because it's taken from kind of a weird angle and stuff.
Yeah.
But he looks so young. And then I look at him. Here it is, 43. That was like spring of 43. Yeah, it's like 2 years later, spring of 45. He's in Barneville, France, and he's got a swagger to him and just looks fit, and he looks tough. It's just really kind of neat to look at.
Toughened by the war and the conditions he had to live under, and what he had to experience, for sure. It's so funny that you say this and how young these guys are, because every time I think about World War II, and prior to us having this discussion, I always think of these guys as, in my mind, in their 30s. That's what I see them at. When you watch these movies or whatever, you see them at their 30s. And maybe it's because they had such responsibility and they knew how to act and they take charge kind of guys, that I made them more mature. But they're 18, 19. Probably most of them are, under 22, 23 maybe?
Yeah.
The majority of it. So it's remarkable that I really have to think about that here's my dad, this hardened guy from war, this tough guy, and he's 20 years old. He's 19, whatever he is.
Yeah, it's amazing how it changed him. And you're right, especially the privates, which that's all Dad was. The privates were always the youngest guys. You get a little bit old, captains and on them. They get older, but the guys that are in the trenches, literally, that's the guys Dad's age. Yeah,
that's crazy. So where'd they head next? You said something about Aachen.
Yeah, so the Army in its infinite wisdom had trucked them all the way to Barneville for one attack that lasted about 45 minutes.
Yeah,
and that was it. And they were there for from late January until I think it's April. Yeah, April. They head out to Aachen. So this time, instead of trucks, they put them on these rail cars that are called 40 and 8s. And so I looked into what they were all about. And so 40 and 8s were rail cars that really existed from World War I. They were French rail cars. And the reason they say 40 and 8 on them is they could hold 40 soldiers or 8 horses.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. So, if this railroad car is designed to hold horses, do you think it's got all the comforts of home?
No.
No.
And probably really high windows,
Yeah, exactly. So it had to be miserable riding on those trains all the way across France back into Aachen, Germany. And so the interesting thing about these rail cars is they kind of became well known with World War II. And after the war, the French government kind of decommissioned them all. They cleaned up a bunch of them, and they put like thank you messages on them on plaques and mounted them on the rail cars. And they sent one rail car to every state of the Union in the United States.
Wow, that's pretty cool. Are they in any museums or anything around? I mean, I've never heard of them.
Yeah, well, I looked up the one that was sent to Chicago.
Yeah,
and the story is that they were building a new rail yard in Chicago, and it was in the way, so they burned it down.
Oh, geez. Well, that seems right. Chicago is the railroad, hub of America. So we'll get rid of history and get another
and make room for the modern cars that are coming in. Yeah,
whatever. That's crazy.
So Colorado doesn't have its either, and it's a bit of a mystery where it ended up. They don't really know, but I like trains a lot.
Yeah.
And so I was on a business trip in Scottsdale, and there's a place, I think it's called MacArthur Park, and I'm walking through it, and they had a rail car there that was the one that FDR campaigned from. Was pretty cool.
Yeah, and he would be in the back of it, right? When he
yes, exactly. So they had that rail car there out in the park, and then I see this old looking rail car. So I'm wander over, of course, and take a look at it. And it's a Merci car, which is what they called these gift cars from France. So it's a Merci car. So I got to see one, up close and personal. And it was really cool. It's a narrow gauge railroad car with these little kind of spindly wheels on it. So it had to be a rough ride
horrible
going
ride.
all the way to Aachen. Yeah.
Chicago may have burnt down our gift car, but I will tell you this: if you're ever in DC and you go to the National History Museum, part of the Smithsonian,
Yeah.
you will see one of the old L train cars. The Ravenswood car is in there, so that was kind of cool that I didn't expect to see when I went there. So
Yeah,
there's a
that's
lot
on
of
my
history, a
that's
lot of
on my
things.
bucket list to get to DC and see that stuff. I know you and I've talked about that
We both
before.
love trains so much,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Well, not only us, there's a reason we have a love of trains. So I got to thinking, Dad was probably in one of these rail cars, had to be miserable. So I was surprised, after the war in, I don't know when he started, the late 60s or early 70s, he started building an O scale model railroad down in the basement for us kids to play with. And I've always been fascinated by the rail cars and everything that he put into that. It was great to play with as a
Oh,
kid.
wonderful.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we had some great cars on it. We had one that was the box car that if you hit it with the missile launcher, it would blow up the box car.
I remember a game we used to play too. You would have a plastic deer and you put it on the rails, and you would have to drive the train around and shut it down in enough time that it would stop before it hit or knocked over the deer.
Right.
And the closest one, it was such a great family thing to do. And
Yeah.
you're bringing up something here that I never really thought of. Could Dad have really liked these trains because he spent so much time of them in them, around the war?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, he was around a lot of trains, I'm sure, and traveled by a lot of train in the continental United States as well as in Europe. So it must have resonated with him some way for him to build this out. But as he got older and we all grew up and left the home, and then Mom and Dad moved, he basically dismantled. He had bridges and stuff on it and everything. He
Yeah, that's
dismantled the
cool.
stuff that wasn't flat, and it ended up getting stored in Mom's basement for all these years, just collecting dust. And the cars were all in boxes. So about I think 2016 or 17, I just got a wild hair and I went down in the basement, started digging through that stuff. And Mom had a big enough room upstairs at her house. I said, be okay if I, set this thing up and tried to make it work. And she's like, fine. So, I drug it upstairs. I had some help from my sons. I got it upstairs and tinkered with it for I don't know how long, read some stuff online, finally got it working again. And it was fun to see it run. And the old engine finally gave out. We had to
The old
replace
blue
the,
one?
the old blue one. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. The old blue one finally gave out, had to replace it with the newer model. But it's still there today. And now who plays with it? The grandkids have kids. So now it's Dad's great grandkids play with it whenever they come over
And
to great grandma's house.
this train is probably 60 years old,
Yeah.
around there. It was one of our greatest family memories. And I remember when you started doing all the tinkering and trying to get everything to work, that I was like, I want to be part of this, but I'm in Chicago. But what does Chicago have? It has a lot of model stores. And so I found an O-line car.
Yeah.
And guess what? It was Pittsburgh, right? So
Yeah.
got to get that one and send
Yeah.
it back home. So we had the Pittsburgh car on the train.
Yeah, we added that just last Christmas. And of course, we have a little Christmas town set up. My sister Patty's done a lot of work on making the Christmas town look real cute. And
Yeah.
Grandma added a ice rink to it. So it's really neat for the great grandkids to have a chance to play with it in memory of Dad.
Yeah, not to belabor the point here, but I remember our other brother, Phil, I think built a little airport. So he modernized it a little
Yeah.
bit and had some model planes next to the trains there.
Yeah.
So let's get back to those actual and real uncomfortable rail cars that the 99th were on when they're going back to Aachen. What happened there?
So, they get into Aachen, and a lot of the memoir stuff I've read is the guys are just amazed at how just ruined it is. And it's barely been reconstructed at all because still the war's still going on. So why rebuild if you don't know what's going to happen? And the Germans that lived there were destitute. So they didn't have to spend much time there because the big push was on to get to Berlin. The Russians were pushing from the Eastern Front. We're coming in from the Western Front. And so Dad's group is moved down and they finally cross the Rhine River and they get into a town they called it Hersfeld. Today it's called Bad Hersfeld. Bad means like bath. It's like where hot springs are. So they get into Bad Hersfeld and their job is basically to go door to door and roust out any Germans, any Nazis that are hiding in these towns as they push their way to Berlin, because most of the troops had, gone way back. And so it was still very dangerous, because there's reports of snipers, firing from high places, and you're walking into homes, you don't know what's in the basement. It had to be very nerve-wracking for them to go through that.
What time of year is this? What month do you think that is?
So this is probably April into early May.
So was that the end of the fighting for Dad?
Well, it was the end of the biggest battles for him.
Okay.
But he's still going door to door and doing these things. In fact, as he goes door to door, he comes across one of the things he brought home, which is a flag.
Wow.
He got an enemy flag. It's not a real big flag, but he's kept it all these years. And it's just amazing to me that it's actually in really good shape still. I asked him about this, said, "Where'd you get it?" He goes, I found it pinned to a door. And he goes, "I just took it and stuffed it in my jacket." So he got his little bit of an enemy capture of the flag there.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's got to be close to victory, right? It's got to be
right.
Close.
Yeah. So the enemy's on the run, and I think they realized what was happening. The Russians were really moving into Berlin fast, and that marked the end of it. So finally, Hitler kills himself, and the Germans surrender on May 8th, 1945, and that ends the conflict.
So that's VE Day, right?
That's Victory in Europe, VE Day. Yep.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So where do they go next? Where was
So Dad's in the southern part of Germany, in a town called Regensburg, which is right on the Danube. You've seen these river cruises, they go right through Regensburg now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So Dad's stationed in Regensburg. And of course, word spreads slowly, and there's going to be some devout Nazis that aren't going to give up. So they carefully have to work their way through these towns. So they're in Regensburg, and Dad gets an interesting call of a mission he needs to go on. And rather than hear it from me, let's hear it from the old man himself. Here's Dad talking about his mission in Regensburg.
There was a Prince Joseph of Austria. He was up in the mountains in Austria, and we were in Regensburg, which is just over the border from Austria. So myself and the lieutenant and I think one other rifleman were in the Jeep, and we went up there to help him, because he had some displaced persons that were getting rowdy, Russians or something like that. And we had to get them out of there. They maybe harmed him or something like that. So we went up to the mountains, to drive to the hills. And while we were there, this Prince Joseph came out of the cabin, a log cabin, big fancy cabin. And he had a long leather coat on. And I don't know whether he brought the gun or one of his servants brought the gun, but he brought this pistol I have, it's an Italian Beretta 32 caliber, and it had never been fired. So we drew lots for it, and I won it.
Wow, that was really good to see that again.
Wow, it's heartwarming.
Yeah. We're so fortunate that our sister Kathy, filmed that back in 1996. And it's so cute that her children, Emily and Steve and Sarah, are there around their grandfather, hearing these stories. And it reminds me that most of the stories that he told were, on the lighthearted side. He very rarely told anything that was scary, even though we know from the research that he went through some scary times.
Yeah, and those kids in that video that Kathy shot, they have their own kids now. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Things just keep on happening. Mm-hmm. All right. Do we know what happened to that gun that Dad won?
Yeah, so he pulled it off somehow. He was able to get it back to the United States, and I did find some paperwork with it that said that he was allowed to bring it back into the States. So,
oh wow,
he had kept it in a safe in the basement, and we rarely got to see it. And Mom still keeps it in a safe, locked up. And so this holster is really cool. This strong leather with this really cool flap on it that locks down. And then this is, the Italian Beretta that he was given.
Small.
Yeah, it's not a real big gun. It's 32 caliber.
Right.
And I did take out the magazine. It's very rusty. The spring's very rusty in it. But But yeah, he brought it back, and our brother Phil at one time bought some rounds for it and took it out and he shot it. Yeah, he took it out to the range and he shot it. So, here's a real piece of World War II history that has a really kind of cool story behind it.
Yeah, a fitting gift for an Italian to get an Italian Beretta.
Isn't that ironic?
For sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So the rest of the story continues, with what Dad was talking about, what he was doing in Regensburg. So let's give another listen to our World War II father.
And then we got rid of the Russian displaced persons. We went back to our camp in Regensburg, and that's when the war was over. We were in Regensburg, Germany. It's down on the Danube River in southern Germany, right at the Austrian border.
And so it's great to hear Dad tell those stories, of working on this problem with the displaced persons and hear it in his own words as to what happened.
Yeah, we've had that video for now, 30 years-ish, and I never had the courage to watch it after he passed. It wasn't something that I felt comfortable in doing. I mean, if that video was truly shot in October of 1996, like we thought, that was shot about a year, a little less than a year, 11 months. A little more, actually. Yeah, he died on November 12th of 97. So about a year from where he passed away. Yeah. So I never had the courage to watch it, but I'm sure glad I had the opportunity to do it for this podcast.
Yeah, and I'm sure glad, Kathy was able to capture that for all of us to enjoy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What was that in the middle of his forehead? It looked like he had is it a bandage or what was that?
No, I think it's a little smiley face sticker, and I'm sure one of the grandkids, and we'll have to ask Kathy, but one of his grandkids, probably Emily, because she was the youngest, probably stuck it on his forehead as a joke. And Dad was such a good sport and just loved the grandchildren that he just left it on there the whole time he's talking about World War II.
It seems fitting that Dad would do that, because I also remember when Dad fell asleep once, Mom painted his nails. And he was at work one day going, what the heck is on my nails? So he was a good sport. Mom was a good sport. So, all right. So things are wrapping up. So after the Germans were defeated, surely Dad got his papers to go home, right?
Yeah, you would think that he was at least thinking about that and hoping for that. But no, their work wasn't quite done yet. They had another special assignment for him, and they moved him out of Germany. And they put him on more trucks and sent him up to a port called Le Havre, or Le Havre, I'm not sure how you say it in France. And they boarded big ships, and they went to Oslo, Norway.
They went to Norway. Huh. So are you saying that the 474th Infantry Regiment, now that's including our guys from the 99th, Infantry Battalion separate, that group made up mostly of Norwegian Americans, they got to go back to their native country?
Yeah, isn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
You think about Dad's reunions with his brothers, and these Norwegian men are getting to go to their homeland, which they joined up for the very specific reason to free Norway. And so I'm sure that was a symbolic move to bring that group, that 99th Infantry Battalion with the 474th Infantry Regiment into Norway to wrap things up. And one of the things that I read about it was kind of touching. This was you'd have heard of Stars and Stripes, which was military newspaper. So this is a short article in Stars and Stripes by a gentleman named Earl Mazo. And the headline is "The 99th Oslo Homecoming, Bitter as Well as Sweet." And it goes on to say, but it was a homecoming for most of the 99th filled with bitterness as well as happiness. T4 Arne Thomason, a medic from Brooklyn who was a native of southern Norway, found out that his cousin had been killed when attempting to escape to England to join the Norwegian Special Forces.
That's their troops.
Yep.
Wow.
One man learned that his wife had died 2 months earlier upon his arrival in Norway.
Yeah, you think it's going to be all the pomp and circumstance about a job well done, but then there's just this loss that on both of, guys not returning home to their native country, and then people that were lost while these guys were away defending their native country.
Yeah. It had to be very touching for them to get to Norway and do that. So while they're in Norway, they're assigned with what we would call mop-up operations.
Okay.
And so there's still quite a few German soldiers, even though the war's over, they're still in Norway, and they all need to be processed and disarmed. And they work on that. And the way they get to Norway is really interesting. There's some great old photos of them when they ship into Norway. They're on these big, I think they're LSTs or they're LS something. I can't remember all the acronyms.
Sure.
But they're these big ships that the fronts open up on them so you can drive out of them.
Kind of like they used on D-Day, or was bigger than that?
They're bigger than the ones, a
Okay.
lot bigger. I mean, they have vehicles in them,
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Literally drive out. Okay.
Literally drive out. Yeah. And so I found pictures of the 474th arriving, and here's Jeeps driving out of there, anti-tank guns driving out of there.
Must have been a spectacle.
Oh, yeah. Of course, I zoom in on every Jeep and I'm trying to see, is that Dad? Is he driving his Jeep there? And so they get them all loaded up and sent over to Oslo to work on their mop-up operations. And they go through and they process the Germans, and they put them on ships and send them back to Germany. And they're there for quite some time. They're there for probably about 3 months, like maybe longer, maybe June, July, August, probably 4 months or so.
Oh, wow.
And so it's summertime up there. And I remember Dad, when he would talk about it, for some reason, Norway really stuck with him because he told a lot of stories about it, maybe because they were lighthearted. But one thing that really stuck with him is how the sun never set.
Yeah.
And he couldn't believe it. He goes, be 2 a.m, the sun would still be up. I mean, there's just this young kid from Pittsburgh, and he's in Norway seeing the sun never set. So it really made a big impression on him all the way until his later years in life.
And Norway was the land of the midnight sun. The sun never set up there. At 1 o'clock in the morning, the sun be shining in your eyes. You're so far north.
You describe the amazing things about their arrival. What was that really like when they arrived in Norway?
Well, there was a lot of pomp and circumstance, and it was a big homecoming, but it wasn't just a homecoming for the 99th. It was a homecoming for the King of Norway, who had been exiled to England. And in Dad's own words, he tells us what that was like and how they were welcomed.
Meeting in honor of the American troops of Norwegian descent in the hall of the University of Oslo, Friday, June 29, 1945.
So the king arriving in Norway was a huge deal for the entire country, the citizens and the troops that were of Norwegian descent. And Dad saved a lot of clippings from that. Even some of the clippings are in Norwegian, and they're kind of interesting to look at. But one of the clippings that I thought was funny that was in the newspaper was it shows the 99th Infantry lined up to welcome the king. They're all in formation, and there's his captains out in front. And so all you see is these little tiny soldiers lined across, and here's Dad once again. He circles this one soldier and he writes, me on it. And it just cracked me up that he did that. It seems
fitting. He did it at the camp when he was training to go to war. He circled me, and this is the end of his journey, hopefully, and he's circling me when he's getting inspected by the King of Norway.
Yes. Yeah.
That's crazy. So does he get it relaxed a little bit? Tell me, please, Ken, is he getting to go home soon?
Well, yeah, they know they're getting close, but they had a lot of downtime because their work was pretty much done, and so he was able to get a 4-day pass to Sweden, cool. And he once again he saved that paperwork, and it's kind of interesting to look at it that he's issued a 4-day pass, and it tells him whether he's going to have meal tickets or not, and things like that. So he gets to go to Sweden and visit that country for 4 days, and I don't know if he met any gals there, but if he had met some, I'd be a little bit taller than I am today.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I am 6 feet, so you never know. It doesn't work out that way.
No,
I'm sorry.
No, not quite.
All right, so he got to relax, got to pass. Got to be on his way home, right?
Yeah, he does. It took a little bit of time for them to get their way home, but I'm sure he was leaving with a heavy heart. Because the statistics of the 99th at the end of the war were the following, and this is just the 99th, not the 474th. The 99th total time in combat, 101 days. Killed by enemy action, 52 of our guys. Wounded by enemy action, we had 270 men wounded. Missing in action, originally 6 men were reported missing in action. but all were later accounted for.
Oh, that's good.
So yeah. So and then the individual medals won by the men of the 99th. They had 15 silver stars awarded, 20 bronze stars, 305 Purple Hearts. So
Wow.
they saw some action.
Yeah.
763 good conduct medals, of which Dad got one of those, and combat infantry badges, 814. Dad has one of those as well.
That's amazing. Yeah, you talk about the Purple Hearts, and we think there's about 1,000 men in this infantry battalion separate.
Yep.
So about a third of them got hurt
Right.
during this war. So
Yeah.
that's incredible. All right.
Yeah.
So he's on his way home. Where did he go?
So they loaded up on a pretty good sized ship called the SS Bienville. And I think I found a picture of that somewhere as well. It's kind of neat to see the photos of those ships. But they're not headed straight to America. They've got to do a stop in Southampton in England because they had what one man wrote, some limeys on board, some of the British soldiers. So I did find a note from another soldier. It says, left Norway on October 17th, arrived on October 21st at 1 a.m. in Southampton, turned around and left Southampton at 4 p.m. that same day. So they were only in port from 1 a.m. till 4 p.m. And then they left and they're headed towards Boston. And some of the stories about them being on this ship, Chris, to Boston is they hit really bad seas. One of the worst storms, I guess, that they'd had in the Atlantic for quite some time. And one soldier writes about sitting in the mess hall trying to eat, and the ship is pitching so much. He said, you didn't know if you're eating out of your mess kit or the other guy's mess kit as they went by. And he said the waves were so high. He goes, the ship would pitch, and he goes, and then the stern would come out of the water, and he goes, you could hear the propellers spin because there was no water there above the water. Yeah. He said he was really frightened. Dad never talked about that part of the ship. He talked about going over when he thought he was going to get torpedoed, but he never talked about the rough seas.
At least they might have had some rough seas when they're in the middle of the Atlantic, but they had a kind of a nice send off by some of the women in the cliffs of Dover, right?
Yeah, so I just learned this yesterday, which I thought was hilarious. So mom told me yesterday that Dad had told her when they were sailing past the White Cliffs of Dover, they're all looking at the White Cliffs because it's an iconic landmark. And up on the top of the White Cliffs are a number of women who have stripped completely naked and are waving goodbye to the soldiers. I just love that.
Yeah, well, that's a good way to go home. So yeah, they had rough seas, but a great send off there. Yeah. So do you know what happened when he finally arrived in Boston?
Yeah, so they finally arrive in Boston on I think it's the 1st of November. They dock, and gotcha. So they're allowed to go. They're allowed to go ashore, and they're allowed to call home and things like that. So there's these, they have these phones set up for these guys to go into these halls and make phone calls. So Dad went into the hall to make a phone call, and coming out of the hall is his brother John. So he runs into his brother John in Boston.
Back in America.
Yeah, they're back in America. So they're getting debriefed in whatever they do when they get back to America. And he's finally discharged on November 5th, 1945, at a place called Uniontown Gap, Pennsylvania. And for the rest of that homecoming story, let's hear it from our World War II dad himself.
I went straight home, and I got home, and I took the train in the East Liberty where we lived, got off the train, carried my bag, and went up to my house, walked up to the house, 3 blocks away.
Wow, what an incredible experience that was. Full circle, here's this kid that leaves, his hometown, wide-eyed, probably not even been out of the state. And now, he leaves on a train to get to the war. Now he's coming home on a train, a totally different grown man. It's a remarkable story.
Yeah. I think about him walking up those doorsteps with his duffel bag and the thoughts that maybe were going through his head compared to when he walked down those steps to go to basic training camp. And he was a changed man. Yeah. And I hope he was welcomed with quite a greeting from, he had 2 sisters. I'm sure they were there. I don't know if any of his other brothers were home or not. And his dad was there. His mom was not alive any longer. So what a sigh of relief it must have been to sleep in your own house, in your own bed after, being away in the service for 2 years.
Yeah, of course it had to have been. It absolutely had to have been. But there's much more to our story. In our next episode, it's a new life for our World War II dad. Thanks for watching and listening to Our World War II Dad. Please remember to like and subscribe and turn on that notification bell so you don't miss an episode.
And if you're just listening to the podcast, please leave us a 5-star review. We would really appreciate it.